Thank you, Bill and Mary Ellen and Ed for making this day possible. Really appreciate it, and thank all of you for spending the day with us. Just by a quick check-in with everybody, how many of you are landowners? Okay. Even if it's 5 acres or 500 acres. So you all in different pieces of land, which is great. How many of you own land that's more than 50 acres? All right, excellent. Well, again, my name is Steve Hagenbuch. I'm a conservation biologist with Audubon Vermont. And when Bill asked us, Jim and I, if we could come down and present here today, it was, maybe we'll present something. I guess our LCD has gone to sleep.
Wake it up.
Okay.
Y'all have ways like that, right?
In talking and thinking about how can we be a steward and manager of our forest land, but do that in a way that considers birds as part of all the other objectives we may have and things that are going on out there, it fit in very well with one of our signature programs that we have here in Vermont, that Audubon has in Vermont, called the Forest Bird Initiative. And that's what Jim and I primarily spend most of our time working on, is thinking about forests and forest birds and how the activities that we do out there on the land will have an impact on the habitat and the populations of those birds going forward. And most of that is done with private landowners, since Vermont is 80% forested and somewhere around 80% of that is in private ownership. So, so it works really well. Now, we call this managing your birds managing your woods with birds in mind. We don't say managing your woods for birds specifically. And the reason for that is that we're trying to think about all the reasons why people own and manage forest land. And most of the time it's not just for birds. It's for wildlife as a very broad term. It's for perhaps timber production, or maybe it's sap production for maple sugaring, or maybe it's aesthetics, or maybe it's recreation, or maybe it's all those things put in there together. So in thinking about that, we try to think about how do we manage the forest for all of those things, but do it with birds in mind, and understand what the habitat needs of these birds are, and how can we incorporate that into our thinking. So Vermont is actually a really great place for managing your woods with birds in mind, because we have a lot of birds here during the breeding season, and we are in the bird breeding season right now. How many of you consider yourselves to be a birder? However you define that term. Okay, so a couple of you. Anybody ever gone on a trip somewhere else out of Vermont to go birding? Yeah, where have you gone?
Oh, Oregon, Alaska,
Okay.
California, Florida, wherever we go.
Wherever you go, birding becomes a part of that trip. Okay. There's a lot of really great, interesting birds all over the country, no matter where you go. If you go to Florida, you're going to get a whole different host of species. If you go to Alaska, you're going to get a whole different host of species. But when it comes to actually maximizing the diversity of birds that you're apt to find when you go out, you know where the best trip to take is?
Backyard.
Go in your backyard. Stay right here in the Northeast. Vermont and our neighboring states have some of the greatest diversity of birds of anywhere else in the country. And this map does a good job of showing that diversity. So the map shows the results of a program called the North American Breeding Bird Survey, which is one of the longest running bird survey programs that we have in this country. It goes back to the 1960s. And it's somewhat of a biased survey because it's their roadside routes, but it does record kind of number of species that people pick up on these survey routes. And you'll see that red, being the highest average number of species recorded on a route, well, where is the red part of the map? Vermont. Adirondack Park in New York, New Hampshire, most of Maine, as well as the upper Midwest, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, those areas, which are very similar in a lot of ways from a habitat perspective to what we have going on here. So we have this great diversity of birds. Vermont is mostly forested, so we have a lot of forest birds that make up that diversity of things. So if you're thinking about where to see a lot of birds and where to really think about birds and have an impact on bird conservation, this is a pretty good place to be. And so that's a lot of the work that we're doing through our Forest Bird Initiative. So these species that make up that great diversity, we do have year-round resident birds, as I'm sure if anybody who puts a feeder out knows. You get things like chickadees and nuthatches and pileated, not that your feeder, but pileated woodpeckers in the woods, maybe a hairy or downy woodpecker, things like that coming in the winter. But then this time of year, from the end of April right through May, seems like every day there's a new bird that's coming on the scene. A bird that spent its winter in a place like maybe Mexico or Central America or even as far south as South America. And they return every year from those wintering grounds back up here, many of them coming right back up to Vermont, some of them continuing on their journey. They stop in here to rest and feed, but many of them are continuing on their journey further north. So this northern forest region, that red area of the map that we often think of as the northern forest, we call them, these birds are the jewels of the northern forest because they're the real bright, many of them are the bright colored songbirds, the warblers in particular that have such vibrant colors on them. And there's a whole host of these birds that sometimes we think of them as our birds, but they're not really our birds. They're almost tropical birds that come here just for the breeding season and go back to those places in the winter months. That's a lot of birds. There's a lot of species. There's over 200 breeding bird species in Vermont. And if you're trying to think about managing your land with birds in mind, and you know that they're not all forest birds, by the way, but you know there's a lot of birds out there to keep track of, it can become overwhelming pretty quick because each bird has a different habitat need and requirement for it. So we took that whole host of birds that potentially could be nesting in the forest, and we distilled that down to a very manageable list of 40.
Yeah, wow.
That's still a pretty big list of things. But we have 40 bird species that we've identified as being responsibility species here in Vermont. And that term really kind of means that we feel like we have a responsibility to think about these birds and consider them in our management. And the way that we identified the birds to be on that list is that they really fit into one of two categories, or in some cases they fit into both of them. First is that some species we're finding are showing long-term population declines throughout their entire breeding range. A great example of that is a wood thrush. It's a bird we still have in the forest. It's not rare, threatened, or endangered. None of our birds on our list fit into that category. But they are showing long-term declines. So that bird is on there for that reason. We think we can do something about that because we are the breeding habitat. This is where birds have a chance to raise their young and hopefully make it to Mexico or wherever they might go for the winter grounds. The other way that we identify these birds is that for some of these species, the Northeast is the core breeding population of those species. So a real extreme example of this is the Bicknell's thrush, if you're familiar with that. That's a high elevation nester that we find at the tops of our mountains that are spruce and fir. 97% of that bird species global breeding population is in the Northeast US and adjacent Canada. So that's a pretty extreme example of that. More close to home in the birds we might find in our forest, one of our warblers called the black-throated blue warbler. We have about 1/3 of that species global breeding population in the Northeast. And that's a significant amount. So we kind of are at the core breeding habitat for many of these species. And that means that what we do out there and what we do to the forest in particular is going to have a global impact on conservation because, again, these are the migratory species. We're just part of that annual life cycle for these global birds. We'll come back to some of those birds in a little bit, and we'll actually distill it down. Jim will take that on to a more manageable 12 bird species we'll get an introduction to. So why do we have all of these birds here? Why do we have such a great diversity and abundance of birds currently coming back to the Northeast and to Vermont in particular? This picture pretty much answers the question. We have a lot of forest. We're in a good place in the Northeast by and large. We have a lot of really good habitat for a lot of these species, and what we're trying to now think about is these aren't, again, rare, threatened, or endangered species. We're saying we only have 200 pair left. What are we going to do to rescue them? What we're saying is, I call that reactive conservation. What we're trying to be is more proactive. We've got a lot of diversity of birds. We still have a lot of really nice habitat for those birds. How can we make sure we don't make the same mistakes that we made in the past with doing things to know what these birds need, why they come here, and incorporate that into our thinking about stewardship. So we have a lot of forest, and as we're starting to find as we're outside on days like this, we have a lot of something that those birds like to eat. Here, the insects, all those insects that are out there is something that is also a key part of why birds are coming here. But we do have a lot of it's a diversity of forest types. Not all forests are created equal, both in the species, the tree species that are there, as well as the sizes of trees. Some forests are really older, larger trees, some are much smaller, more shrubby types of trees. We have a mix of those different conditions of forests, and then we have the variety of different forest types, the hardwood forest, the softwood, so the maple, beech, birch type forest, the softwoods with the hemlock, the white pine. Mixed forests obviously is a mix of those two, hardwoods and softwoods together. We also get these forested wetland areas, forested swamps, which can bring along some additional species specific to those places. Boreal forest or high elevation, or particularly in northern Vermont, the Northeast Kingdom, where we see spruce and fir more in the lowland areas. And then riparian forests that line our streams and rivers, can add some habitat for some additional species as well. So when you throw all of this together, this diversity of forest types, forest ages, we get a lot of diversity of birds going on with it. So things are pretty good, as I said, but there are threats to these forest birds, and some of these threats are some of the reasons why we think we're seeing declines in some of those species. The climate change, whatever your thoughts may be on that, if we use projections and models to describe what could happen in changing climate, we have identified what that may do to bird populations. And for some species, it's actually going to be a benefit, but for others, it's not going to be. A lot of the birds that we're focusing in on with our Forest Bird Initiative are likely to see some negative implications if climate change continues on and we see significant changes to the forests that we have out here. Non-native and invasive plant pests and plants. I know that's something that probably many of you know. You have some non-native plant species that are on your property. There's a lot of debate about what's the implications of that to birds specifically. One thing that there's less debate on about is that non-native invasive plants generally have less diversity of insects on them than native plants do. And we know that during the breeding season, it's insects that make up the main food source for these species. So if we have areas that have just an abundance of non-native plants, it's likely that the insect diversity that those birds are looking for would be lower than if those plants were native plants. Forest fragmentation and conversion. So conversion basically meaning a forest is converted to something else. So it's not a forest anymore. And fragmentation, how many people are familiar with that term? It's essentially when you have one big block of forest that then gets broken into smaller functional blocks due to some sort of conversion perhaps, or roads going through, house sites being put into that forest. And instead of having one big forest block which has higher function and opportunity for birds to successfully nest, we have smaller blocks of forest going on. And then the one that we're going to talk most about here today, as you as landowners and land managers have an opportunity to really address, is forest structure and composition and diversity of tree species and other plant species that are out there. A lot of our forests, and this is a great place to look at this because thinking about the history here, how it was agricultural land that has reverted to forest. That's true of probably many of your properties. Much of Vermont was 80% open land, not that long ago really, and has reverted back to forest. So as a result, the forests are still maturing. They're not old forests most of the time by any stretch of the imagination. And so something we call structure, which we'll talk more about, tends to be generally lower. And in order to have higher quality habitat and greater diversity of bird species in a forest, we like more structure going on, and management can be a way to achieve that. So you are the key to conservation. Private forests in Vermont are really the key to bird conservation, and what you do on the land does make a difference, even if it's only 10 acres of land. If you do something on there that can help with birds, because birds don't see the property lines or the pins that mark the corners. So they're just all over, they're just traveling the landscape, and so little actions in one place can add up to a big action within the landscape itself. And particularly, working forests, if you are managing that forest and you're able to derive some sort of economic return from that, it can help keep the forest as forest and not need to feel like you can't have the holding costs of that land anymore and need to sell it in order to be able to make it. So whether that's timber or sugaring or non-timber forest products, mushrooms, things like that, working forests are really part of this, and a lot of what we'll be talking about is how the working forest and the management of that is a part of thinking about habitat. But one message I do want to make clear is that we're not saying that every acre of forest has to be managed. So you can manage your forest land and do it in a way that is complementary to providing good quality habitat. But by no means are we saying that everybody should be managing every acre of their forest land, because there are some places that really aren't conducive to being actively managed and can still provide great habitat as well. One of the things that management can increase, if you look at this particular picture of a forest stand, so this is basically what we call a single age stand or an even age stand. You've got your canopy trees and not really a lot of other things happening, not a lot of young trees or shrubs growing there. But active management, if it opens up some gaps in the canopy, allows some sunlight to get to the forest floor, can result in, this isn't a before and after, so I apologize for that, but just basically showing after you do some management, you can create, this is some of that structure that we'll talk more about happening with young trees coming in, there's more sunlight getting in there and allowing that to happen. And that's going to enhance the habitat opportunities for birds within the forest. So some other complex structure happening. Let's go through that real quick. So, because we're going to actually address all of those things here in just a moment. All right. So this is really where we kind of get into the meat of what we'll be doing today. If you have, management plans, if you're the landowners out there, how many of you have a management plan for your property? Okay. So if you have a management plan for your property, you probably had a forester go out there, do some sort of inventory to know what do you have to start with, what are the tree species, what are their sizes, how many of them are there, and that information, that inventory information, can help be used and to help to decide what are our management opportunities moving forward. So you don't want to just dive in and start doing things without knowing what you have. Likewise with birds and bird habitat, we kind of like to get an idea of what's out there right now, both in terms of the bird community, but also the habitat opportunities, the habitat conditions that exist. One of the ways that we do that as Audubon staff is we conduct things called habitat assessments. It's essentially a rapid inventory and assessment of the current conditions on land. So if a landowner is really interested in birds, in particular, as one of their objectives, they'll know kind of where they're at with that in providing habitat for those birds, and then what might you do moving forward with management to make it better, or maybe create some conditions that aren't already there but that you would be interested in having. The ideal situation in getting out and doing any of these things, there's at least 3 people involved there. One of them is me. Doesn't have to be me, but someone who can kind of look at the habitat perspective. Maybe it's Chuck back there with NRCS. A forester who's managing the property. Guess who this person is?
You.
It's you, the landowner. So you get all these 3 people together. The landowner knows what their goals are. Forester has in-depth knowledge about how silviculture and forest management can achieve certain things on the ground. And then you get the bird guys in there describing desirable conditions that would be ideal for supporting birds on the ground. So when you bring all these 3 people together, good things can happen. When we're looking at assessing a habitat, we really focus in at the property level when we're doing that. But it's also important to think about the landscape in which a property sits, because maybe you're the landowner of that perfect rectangle, which is all, looks like probably mature, high canopy forest. If that's your property, you have some options that you don't have if this is your property down here. And then what all this other stuff that's going on around you will influence and have implications for what happens on your property. Because landscape influences, whether it be an open area around you or all forest around you, can help figure out what's going to happen with bird species being able to successfully nest and rear their young or not be able to, or just what species are likely to even come onto your property. So it's not just what's happening with you, it's what's happening around you in the landscape as well. But focusing at the stand level, so a forest stand is kind of a management unit of thinking about when you're out there going to be working in the forest, where the tree species, composition, And the size of, it's a similar unit of forest that can be thought of as a discrete management unit. So we really look at that stand level, and this is what we'll be doing this afternoon, particularly when we go outside, is looking at the stand level. So what we'd be looking at in a habitat assessment is a variety of different habitat features. We're just going to go through those really quickly here and spend more in-depth time on it when we go outside. By the way, if you haven't picked up your landowner guide yet, those are next to Jim there on the table. Make sure you get that. All of this is in there. So it's all described very well, the same sorts of things. But understory vegetation is something that sometimes we find it in forests and sometimes we don't. And we define understory vegetation as live, woody stemmed vegetation, so ferns don't really factor into this so much. Trees and shrubs that are from 0 to 6 feet in height. So basically a person height, we call the understory layer. And the way that we've kind of broken these different layers of the forest down is based on how the literature, the research out there on birds kind of shows birds separate themselves out within the forest. So this is 0 to 6 foot, and then down here on the bottom, this low to high, this is describing the function of these individual pictures to birds that, for which this feature, understory vegetation, is important. So for example, you see any low trees and shrubs in the first 6 feet of the ground?
No.
No. So if you're a bird like a black-throated blue warbler, which we mentioned earlier, has a third of its breeding population in the Northeast, this is going to be lower habitat quality for you because you want to nest in that low, dense, woody vegetation. It's just not here. This is a little better, and over there, there's a lot more of it. So we think about how can these different features function for birds, be able to find nesting sites and places to forage, particularly for insects during the breeding season, find cover to put a nest in. All of those things are a component of habitat that we're going to be looking for with this. So in assessing the habitat, very qualitative, easy way to do it. Low habitat quality for those bird species associated with it, and higher habitat quality with that image over there. We'll learn of a simple way to remember all of this and do it when we go out in the field this afternoon.
Do you also assess what is in the understory, so if it's all honeysuckle and buckthorn, is that?
Yes, yeah, great question. So in some cases, we do find it looking like that, but it's all non-native, what we are calling non-native invasive plants. I would say that the birds do nest in that. Some bird species can nest successfully. Some research has shown do not nest as successfully. So we would still say that even though the birds are using it, it's not the desirable condition. So it may be functioning, and birds are using it, they may not be using it successfully, so we call it a trap, an ecological trap, where they go there, they try to raise their young, but they just don't survive. Predators can get them more easily in some cases. So we note that, and we say that there's a lot of structure there in that understory layer, but it's made up, comprised of those species. We do the same thing then for what we call the mid-story. So understory went to 6 feet. Mid-story goes from 6 feet to about 30 feet in height. And believe it or not, this is where I would say 90% of the bird species that are nesting in the forest are within that range, from ground level to about 30 feet in height. So I drew pictures when I was a kid of forests and trees and bird nests. I always put the bird nest right on the top of the tree with a big bird sitting up there. It was wrong in most cases. That's just not where the birds are nesting. There are some that nest higher, but most of them are within these first 2 layers of vegetation, understory and midstory. Same sort of thing, low function, a little bit better, and over there, even though it's beech, which that's the species mix in that particular photo, may not be, from a timber perspective, the desirable species you'd be looking for, it still is providing the structure that birds can use for finding nesting locations within. Fine woody material, little sticks, twigs, brush on the ground, dead stuff on the ground, is another important feature. Is there fine woody material on the ground here? There is. There's quite a bit of it, actually. There's little twigs all over the place on the ground, yet I put it in the low function category. Over here, though, we say that's high function for birds that use this particular feature. What's the difference between them? They both have fine woody material. One's low function, one's high function. So what's the difference in between the two of those?
Cover?
Cover. If you're a bird, it's going to be hard to find cover. Even though there's a lot of material here, it's spread out all over the floor. Whereas over here, we had trees that were harvested, dropped, and the tops were left there in the forest. They're much higher, provide good cover for birds, at least until they start to decay and go back to the soil. But that provides cover, foraging places for insects in particular, and some birds even nest in those brushy piles of things. So key thing is to think about what the function of all of these things are and how we assess their, whether they're good for birds or not.
This is slash just leaving it where it falls, basically.
Leaving where it falls, if you can do that, sometimes it ends up in a place where it's going to impede, whether it's a trail that you're on or a road. So moving it off to the side, but leaving it there in the forest is going to provide better opportunity, more opportunities for birds. But the key thing, another thing with all of this, is that we're talking about it in the context of birds, but there's a lot of other overall forest health benefits to these same sorts of features. Particularly if you're in a place where you have a lot of deer in your forest and all your young trees that start growing in the forest get eaten by deer. If a seedling can get started and going in that brush pile, the deer are less likely to go in there after it and eat it. So it often gives them a chance to grow up and make it past the deer browse, as it's called, stage of things. That's also a lot of nutrients that can be returned back into the soil for things to grow as well. And then coarse woody material. So fine woody material are the smaller twigs. We usually define them as 4 inches in diameter or smaller. Coarse woody material are the larger logs, maybe a whole tree trunk that comes on the ground. So here's a little snippet of a tree trunk. Coarse woody material left on the ground. Low function. Over here we've got the whole trees, the coarse woody, but also even the fine woody material that was left behind. So achieving that, we know the function of the fine woody material. Coarse woody material, one of the more common ways that's used is by the ruffed grouse as a drumming log to get up on. We also find underneath those logs, we have these moist environments where things like redback salamanders like to live, and our thrushes in particular, they do feed on salamanders and other insects that might live under there, so it provides a source of food for those animals as well. So this just isn't going to be the same opportunities there as we see on the right-hand side. And then this, we take it for granted, but leaf litter that covers the ground. We walk all over it. We usually don't even think twice about it being down there, but it actually has a couple of real high habitat benefits for birds. And this shows one of them. Anybody know what that is?
Ovenbird nest?
Yeah, it's an ovenbird nest. So an ovenbird is one of our responsibility species that we have. It's a warbler, even though it doesn't have warbler in its name. And it makes its nest by bringing together leaf litter, usually deciduous of the hardwoods, but also some pine needles will often get mixed in there too if it exists, into this oven dome, this kind of dome-shaped oven with a little hole in the side that they go right in there and plop their eggs into it. You often don't see them out in the forest, even though they're very common, unless you walk by and you flush a bird from your feet. And then you start looking around and you might find that dome shape there. So in the absence of leaf litter, we're not going to have that nesting opportunity for ovenbirds. And then we have our thrushes again, in particular wood thrush, hermit thrush, veery. They often dig around in the leaf litter looking for spiders and insects and other arthropods that live in there. So having a nice layer of leaf litter is going to provide food and nesting opportunities for some of our birds out there. And then another one people hear a lot about, cavities and snag trees. You all know what a snag tree is? It's a standing dead tree. So this is a great example of a snag over here. Lots of use goes on there, lots of wildlife use happens in there, whether it be for woodpeckers and nesting or looking for insects that are all over inside of those. But you also get, in really big snags, you might get even a bear that uses, if there's a hole at the base of that tree that they can get into for the winter months. Flying squirrels, raccoons, all kinds of things use those standing dead trees. The bigger the better. But then we also have cavity trees. And cavity trees can be live trees that have a hole in them usually some decay somewhere in that tree. It's probably very hard to see with the lighting here, but right there is a small hole about this big around, and that is a nest cavity for a yellow-bellied sapsucker, and it's in an aspen or popple tree, which that tree species is often used by sapsuckers, yellow-bellied sapsuckers, another of our responsibility species, for excavating nesting cavities in. So it's a live tree, but it is decaying in the middle, and it provides a great opportunity for that nesting to happen.
Can I ask a question? See,
Yes.
when you say excavate, so they actually will take an area that's kind of in decay and then just expand it with that, yeah?
Right, so they'll go into, they'll go through the outer bark and get into where that decay column is, and then that's where the actual nest would be put, is in that. And they're just making the hole to get into that area. And they probably, depending on how big an area, they might clean it out some. These aren't big areas that they're nesting in, just big enough. And birds, you know, sometimes they look bigger than they are because there's so much feathers on them, so they can squeeze through some pretty small holes to get inside of those. So once we put all of that together, that assessment of current conditions out there, then we can start to think about what we're going to do on the land. We have put together, with our partners at the Vermont Department of Forest Parks and Recreation, something we call silviculture with birds in mind. So silviculture is really, it's the, and George can fill in my definition here, but it's the art and science of controlling the establishment, the species composition, the growth of a forest to meet different objectives. So silviculture with birds in mind is doing that with birds in mind, and that could be for the function point of creating some understory development for birds like wood thrush to nest in. Maybe it's creating a larger open area for a bird like a chestnut-sided warbler to find habitat in. Maybe it's thinning through a mature forest stand to create some openings that are going to be places for the eastern wood pewee to find food, go foraging, or material on the ground for the white-throated sparrow. And from there, I thought there was one more picture, so I was going a little fast. Anyway, so that's going to be a segue for this afternoon, though. Silviculture management of the forest with birds in mind, thinking about what we've got, habitat assessment, and what we could do as a result of that. But before that happens, Jim's going to come up and he's going to walk us through what we call the Birders Dozen. So really 12 birds we'll focus most of our efforts on today, and hopefully get people to start to remember a couple of those anyway when we're out there and get a chance to hear them. Does anybody have any quick questions about what we just went through? It's all going to be covered again in the woods in the real setting, and it's also covered in the guide that you have.
So basically, when I cut my trees in the late fall for firewood, I should just leave the branches scattered about and no brush piles.
You can do brush piles too,
Okay.
but you don't have to do all of it into brush piles. So instead of taking all those tops and bringing them together
Yeah.
into scattered brush piles, you can just leave some of it out there,
Yeah.
Wherever it may be, as long as it's not in the way of because we think about how nature does things,
Yeah.
right? And birds will often do, you know, they're more apt to be better suited to what nature does anyway than what we think they should do. So when a tree falls in the woods naturally and another tree falls over here, unless they fell over top of each other and made a brush pile, they don't make brush piles.
Yeah.
But there are benefits to them, certainly, for lots of other species. So do a few brush piles, but leave some of it scattered as well. Okay. Oh, yes.
I just want to ask again to be reminded, you said 90% of the population lives in both the understory up to 6 feet and that growth?
For nesting purposes, yes.
Okay.
Yep. I'm not,
No, I understand. I
it's
just
a
want
rough,
to
but the point of saying that was most of the birds in the forest nest in that height range.
Just curious what the criteria is to get into the Birders Dozen.
Okay.
Why
Why were those birds picked as part of it? So we'll let Jim take that from here.
Thank you.
Okay.
Wait, I have just
Oh, yes.
one
Yeah,
very
yeah.
quick
Yeah,
question,
yeah.
and that is, my wife and I created 2 fields which have to be mowed because we raise sheep. But when do they stop, when do the ground birds, the birds that use the field as a nest, when does that stop?
So you're
So that
talking
I
more,
can then
Yeah.
mowed the
You're
field.
talking more about grassland like bobolink.
Yes, or
in
whatever,
particular,
I have no idea.
So if you have some of those grassland species, a bobolink would be
Yeah.
one of them that we often think of.
When-
Usually by the third week of July, the young are mobile enough that if you come through and mow, they'll be able to escape
Okay.
from that. The big issue with
Fourth
rat,
week, then.
with mowing and grass nesting birds, oftentimes the mower may not, if there's birds in a nest or eggs even, maybe the nest doesn't get squished by the machinery, but you ever go to a hayfield after it's been freshly cut and you see crows and all kinds of things out there picking around? It's because there's a lot of things they can now find, like baby birds. So that's often what happens in those settings. So if you wait till the birds our young ones can be mobile and scatter, then you've waited really long enough.
Okay, so fourth week should be guaranteed.
Yeah. At last week of July and early August, birds have already done their, at least one brood of those birds has gotten out. Okay.
Hi, so I'm Jim Challow, and I'm the managing director at Audubon Vermont. And so I'm going to sort of take the birder side of things. So Steve spent a lot of time kind of orient us in the landscape and why Vermont's important. And we heard that great story about how this is a great place to grow up as a kid. Well, he gave that great story about how this is a great place to raise kids for birds, right? So he also showed you that slide really early on that had those 40 responsibility birds up there. And if you're like me, it's really visually striking, but impossible for me to sort of pick out each and every one of those and understand what they all do and how they fit into the forest and where you find them in the landscape and everything. And so it can be a little overwhelming, right? I could spend all morning talking about those 40 birds, but I'm pretty much sure most of you would leave here thinking I learned one of them. So what we decided to do was kind of pick 12 birds out of that big group of responsibility birds. Going back to that concept that these are birds that are relatively common in our landscape because we're sort of at the core of their breeding habitat or we're seeing long-term declines. Pick 12 of them to kind of tell that bigger story. They, in a sense, become the ambassadors for that big group. And then you, as a landowner, can begin to learn these 12 birds. It'll tell you a little something about what's going on in your property. Either if they're not there, maybe there's things you can do to make the habitat better through some management to get them there. Or if you have them there, how do you keep them there? Okay. So what I want to do is I'm going to go through the birds dozen. I'm going to sort of quiz you all along the way, and then hopefully what we'll do is we'll go outside, and because we are in the third week of May, this is like prime migration season. I mean, everything's pretty much coming back right now. Some birds are even settling down on the nest. We were out yesterday doing a long birding excursion and a birdathon, and we were actually starting to see birds exhibiting nesting behavior. So some of them are already settled in. They're starting to do what they're here to do, which is make baby birds. Okay, so you asked about what the criteria are. So we picked these 12 birds. So the very first one was, let's pick some birds that, for folks like you, maybe not experts who spend all your time and get paid to do stuff like that, which I'm have the benefit of being able to do that as a career, is they're simple to learn by sight and sound. So are they visually striking? Do they have good sort of visual cues that you can key in on to understand this? And then, this time of year, you look out there, and like from my perspective right now, all I see is green looking out the window here. So a lot of leaves out there. So unfortunately for some of these birds, despite being really colorful, you may not see them all the time, right? So what's their song? What are they saying to you? What are they saying to each other? So how do you sort of learn those and understand those? So I'm going to kind of go through that in a minute here. The other thing we want to do is not just have like one bird, a bunch of birds that all use the same type of habitat. So we wanted that variety. Steve sort of showed that slide earlier that had like boreal forests and hardwood and mixed wood and old forests and young forests. So we wanted to kind of get that suite of birds because that 40 sort of represents all that diversity of forest. That diversity of birds is tied to that. So if we can find those 12 that sort of give us that sense of what's going on in the forest. So that was the next criteria. And then lastly, we wanted to pick a few that were in there that really do sort of raise the stakes a little bit, right? So we wanted people to be aware that despite being very common in our landscape, there are some of these birds we are seeing declines. And eastern forest birds, as a group, have declined over the last 30 years, and there's by roughly 15%. Okay, so can we sustain that over time? I'm not sure. So that's why we're trying to work with you all to make it the best quality habitat as possible, so we can either reverse those declines or at least slow them down, so we can then start dealing with some of the other threats. So those are the big three criteria. So we're looking for relatively easy to identify, have that kind of diversity, and then finally showing some decline. So this is down, and boy, that looks a little blurry, but that's not you. That's my slide. So we have these 12 here, and you can see they sort of, and I think this is in the landowner guide.
Yep.
This exact diagram, but you can see they're sort of that black-throated blue warbler. They're down low here. The black-throated green. So it sort of shows you they're kind of spread up and down throughout the forest types and everything. So what I'm going to do is kind of go through each one of these for the next few minutes. We're going to key in on them. I'm going to give you a couple tips along the way on how to do it. And then as you're all revved up and ready to go, we're going to step outside. And I've never been here, so we're going to kind of wander around and see what happens. So what goes on. So that first habitat.
You can skip through that. That's actually not supposed to be there.
Don't be. Oh, Steve, what are you doing?
I thought I got rid of it. There you go.
All right. This is that first habitat, right? So what are we seeing here?
Variety of heights.
Yeah, what else?
Edge.
Yeah. So young trees, we have some grass here, so young, you're sort of moving into a forest back here. This is generally what we call early successional forest, or I know when we talk to foresters about that, they say, that's not early successional because it's not an early successional tree, which is this debate we get into. So it's a young forest. Right? So it's a young kind of baby forest, and that there are certain birds that really use this. And once these trees, these shrubs that you see growing here, get above about 15 feet, they're gone. So they take advantage of this ephemeral condition on the landscape. Where you have an old field or an old clear cut or something like that growing up, they see that and they love this tight young trees, and they key in there and they're in there and they take advantage of that. And then when that's gone, they move on and try to find somewhere else to do that. That class of birds, that young forest shrub birds, are declining, out of all that big group, are declining the most. And so if you think about why is that happening, it's a lot of debate, but part of that is our past land use history, right? So we talked about that. We cleared Vermont, and then the farm started being abandoned in the mid 20th century. Things started. Trees started growing back, and so we had a lot of those birds, which was about the time we started doing those breeding bird surveys, and so we had a lot of young birds. Then all that stuff starting to grow up, and we haven't had, in some cases, a lot of management going on to promote that kind of growth, so we're losing that. And so we want to keep those birds in the mix. So here we go. Our first one coming up here is this guy. All right, so I know there's a few birds in a room here. Anybody know this bird?
Woodcock.
Woodcock, yes. So, Timberdoodle's another name for it. This is just, I love this bird because it's like, this is only a mother could love it. This is what's cool about this bird is it's in our forest, but this is actually a shorebird. It's related to all those birds when you go to the beach and see them running up and down, and the yellow legs and all that stuff. This is what this guy is, but he's learned to live up here, and they like big open fields. And this time of year, when you go out in those fields in the fall, you often will hear this.
There's been a bunch of them just up the road.
Yeah, okay.
Just making.
Yeah, so peep. And then they do this display. They go up, and then their wings, they come down, and they land. And they keep doing that over and over and over again. Okay? So that they're doing that. They're here really early when they come back. And that's just as I was working. Does he just go on like this forever?
Until you Jason.
Okay, so let's see. Okay, I'm just gonna talk over my friend, the woodcock. So anyway, young, so they like that opening here, and I'm gonna just skip here. This is kinda so I'm gonna go on with the woodcock. But anyway, so they like that big opening for displaying, but then they like young forest alders a lot of time, kind of wet soils where they will feed. And you saw that, these like they kind of go along, they do this sort of Egyptian walk. They are digging around with this beak, which if you look at this beak, it's really cool because it's kind of flexible at the end, and they feed down there and they find the earthworms and everything, and they're poking around so much, their ears are down low so they can hear, and their brain is actually upside down in their head. So, I mean, this is just, they've evolved to take advantage of that stuff that's going on in that alder stuff. And then when they're done with feeding and stuff, they will go sort of back more into the woods to nest, right? So they need this kind of complex situation of forest and young forest and field. So it's really complicated. Great bird. It's a great, people love to manage for it. One of the reasons they love to manage for it is they also love to hunt it. So it's a great kind of connection there with folks. So that's our first bird's dozen. Got that down? All right? Not the easiest thing to see, but if you hear that painting sound, you're on this. All right, so this guy, I love this guy, right? Mainly because I wish I had hair like him. Anybody, so what are the features here you're seeing on this bird? Some of the things you want to think about when you're looking to identify birds is, yeah, there we go, chestnut-sided. This is actually called the chestnut-sided warbler. So he's got this little swath here, the yellow cap there. They really, these are what we call a gap bird. So when you have that gap in the forest, they'll key in on that. And it can be as small as, what do you say, Steve, half acre, maybe an acre?
If you're
Let's
thinking
call it
about
an
being able
acre.
to nest,
Yeah.
probably would be at least an acre.
At least an
of
acre,
opening.
yeah. So you need sort of an acre. Yeah, go ahead.
Are the male and female similarly colored?
No.
No.
So okay, so great question. So most of the time I'm showing males here.
Okay.
Most of the females, if you think about it, they're going to be sitting on a nest. They don't want to be flashy like this. This is breeding color for this guy. He's out there, he's like, I'm dressed up, I'm ready to go, look at me. So he's out there trying to be flashy, and he's singing to be flashy because he's telling the female about where he is, or he's telling other males, back off, this is my home. The females are much more drab. You'll see a little squashy, but mostly green. And because they're sitting on that nest, right? And they're not singing for the most part. Maybe you'll get a chip here and there, but they don't sing. The males are the singers, they're the crooners, okay? So this guy, you'll be in an open, like that young forest, and you're gonna hear him. He's gonna say to you, he's gonna say, please, please, pleased to meet you. Right? Hear that? Please, please, pleased to meet you. And you will hear this a lot in those openings, okay? But again, so there he is. He's our chestnut-sided warbler. So he is, once that gets 15, 20 feet, that shrubby stuff is gone, he's out of there. Moving on to something else. All right, so that's sort of our young forest birds. There's a bunch of other ones that are in that set of 40, but those are two for you, okay? Question?
Yeah, I have a utility easement behind my house, so I just have shrubs.
They love it. They love utility lines. Those big wide ones, if it's managed well, and it's shrub, which the utility companies love shrubs because they don't grow into the power lines. So yeah, you will find a lot of those birds. Other ones that are on that list are like morning warbler, Nashville warbler, those are other ones that you can find in those kind of conditions.
We're probably going to walk to a utility corridor and hear that bird
Yeah.
today.
Oh, okay.
So I'm hoping we'll hear that, because they're just fun. They're good. Okay, so that's that young forest. So the next kind of condition here, which is what I'm going to have, I have a group of birds in here, is that this is that sort of hardwood, kind of mature forest condition that Steve was talking about here, with multiple layers and a good canopy and everything in there, and snags. It's a beautiful piece of wood. Is that your backyard, Steve? You
No.
wish, right? All right. So our first guy is this guy. Steve kind of referenced him a little bit here. Yeah, it's our sapsucker. It's a woodpecker. It's one of our. It's one of the few migratory woodpeckers that we have. So they actually leave during the summer, during the winter, and then they come back here pretty early in the spring. And they're the ones that, when you find trees with the horizontal drilling, like you'll see a line of holes and then another line of holes. That's what the sapsucker does, and he's literally sucking sap. So he drills these holes, and what happens is the sap starts to come out, and then he comes back and he feeds in there, and that attracts insects, and the insects get stuck in there, and he'll feed on that. So, and the cool thing about this bird, which I think is cool, is they have this association with hummingbirds. So there's research out there that shows that these guys will show up a couple weeks later after they've started drilling their holes. The hummingbirds will show up and actually feed out of those holes as well, and they will nest nearby where the sapsuckers are. So there's this sort of connection there with that. So it's kind of cool how they all kind of work in tandem there. So identifying features for this, unlike so Steve mentioned hairy woodpeckers and downy woodpeckers. They look very similar to this, but those birds have sort of horizontal striping on the back. This guy has this wing bar, so it's a vertical white stripe on the wing. That's your key feature, because the rest of it looks a lot like the other ones. They call it the yellow-bellied sapsucker. Boy, you got to be in the right light and have had the right breakfast and everything like that to get lucky and see the yellow. So you will see it occasionally, but oftentimes you don't. So this is really the feature, the thing I look for. The other thing I look for is that slow kind of whacking that goes on. Every time these guys start coming back, the phone starts ringing at the office. And then people call them, I got this bird. That's their other sound. They kind of sound like a squeaky toy almost. Lovely song, right? So this guy, he's, rather than singing, because you heard his voice, not the best thing, things like I do, is more, he uses that drumming to define territory. So they will actually seek out things that make a lot of noise. So they'll drum on gutters. They will drum on, I've seen them drumming on street signs. I've seen them, we have sap buckets at the Audubon Center. When they're stacked up, they'll be drumming on sap buckets. So they look for that because it's like it's like banging the drum. It's like the drum circles at, Wall Street or something. They're like letting people know they're there, and that's what they're doing. And so we get calls all the time. It's like, what do I do with this bird? It's eating. Well, actually, it's probably not eating bugs in your house. It's just you found something great to whack on in your house. Give it time, it'll stop. All right. Next guy. So this is really easy to identify. Not really, right? So this bird, kind of gray. You're looking for little wing bars here, but here's the thing that's going to tip you off. They got these little whiskers here. You're never going to see that. But the reason I'm pointing these out is because this is a type of flycatcher. So they feed on the wing, and they use these kind of to help them find those insects, right? But you may have heard this guy. Anyone?
Easternwood peewee.
Yeah. Peewee. And give it a go. So you got a couple different songs, but this is our peewee. How do you spell it? Hold on for a second. So they like kind of big woods, a little bit less understory. You'll find them a lot of times around openings, like logging roads or landings. And they sweep out and they grab on the wing and they come back, and they will do that over and over again in the forest. So they like that kind of open understory a little bit. And they do this thing called sallying. That's what they call it. They'll land on the branch, they'll go out, they'll grab the bug, they'll go back and land. They'll go back, and they just kind of keep doing it over and over again. So it's good we have that in there because they do sort of represent that bigger kind of tree condition there. This is one of the last migrants to come back. They just showed up sort of like last week, so they do come from like South America. We're seeing declines in them. We're actually seeing declines in a lot of our birds that eat insects on the wing, swallows and everything like that. Still not quite sure why we're trying to figure that out. So that's our eastern peewee.
Very similar to Phoebe,
Right.
if you have Phoebes around your homes.
Yeah. Same kind of family, but they're in deep woods kind of bird. All right, so this one, I don't even know what, I'm just gonna start the song. Just, right? You hear that in the woods around dusk or in the morning? E-O-lay is the other way, where they have that little chattering at the end there. Like some people call it shattering glass at the end. You may know this bird? Yeah, well, you guys are good. I can do that. You guys are on it. All right. So unlike the hermit thrush, really clearly defined, spotting on the breast, good eye ring here. Here's another, this is a good thing to look for on all birds when you're trying to identify, do they have that eye ring? So you're looking for that. But really what's keying you in is this kind of color. The other thing is, like the hermit thrush is a little more, these are sort of washed out a little bit. It's almost like, they look more like this as opposed to these defined ones. They're also a little, hermit thrush tends to bob its tail a little bit, and their song has a long introductory note, so that's the difference there. But so this is a wood thrush, declining throughout its range, so we're worried about this bird. We're seeing like 6% declines a year in this bird, so that's just not sustainable over time.
Where does it spend the winter?
Mexico, Central America, down to Costa Rica, a lot in the highlands of Nicaragua. So it's actually looking like our population. This bird's been, it's cool about this bird, we know a lot. We're learning more and more about it because it's big enough that we can put like geolocators on it and stuff. So we do like technology and figure out where we're going. We're actually starting to narrow down like, where do our birds go in the Northeast? And it looks like sort of the central highlands of Nicaragua are where our Vermont wood thrushes are going. So what's going on down there? Think about it. So a lot of deforestation, conversion to agriculture, coffee management that's more sun grown, so as opposed to shade grown coffee. So another reason if you like coffee like I do to stick to that stuff that's shade grown. So that's our wood thrush. Here, as Steve sort of talked about that, it's a lower, they like that shrubby layer in the forest and kind of make canopy. So here's his cousin, who looks similar, but let's just play his song. You heard that one? So think about it. Descending. It's actually very, yes, very good, because he says his name every time. So if you listen to this song here, that's what he said there. Beer. That's their call. So, okay. I was watching one of these the other day, and when they do that veer thing they're doing, they don't even open their mouth. You just see their throat go, beer. That's all they do. They break out. So that's our veery, and so it is a thrush. They tend to like sort of moister soils. I see them along kind of more kind of riparian areas in the forest. So moister soils, whereas the wood thrush a little bit less so. But you'll see similar, but just has kind of more of a wash here. It's generally brown overall. So not great visual cues here, but that song is just unmistakable, right? And they're actually singing in harmony with each other. So if you slow that down, you can kind of hear the difference when you're independently singing within their throat there. It's pretty cool. So that's our veery. And then there's this guy, right?
We're still in our mature hardwood forest.
This is a mature hardwood. This guy is a matured hardwoods. Tend to be, we're talking George, you guys got a lot more oak down here, so they like oak. They tend to be a little more prominent in those.
There's been one there's the big ash in front of the house
Yeah,
there.
wow. So, anybody know the name of this one? Like the black-winged redbird? No, it's not. No. So scarlet tanager. But they, so what you're going to hear for that is they kind of sound, if you know a robin, that sort of sound, sing-song, you know, cheerio, cheery me, they sound a lot like that, except for they sound like they've been, they have a sore throat. Kind of hear that? Just a little bit raspy. And then they also do this little thing where they say, chipper.
Yeah.
Hear that? Chipper. Yeah. So that's a scarlet tanager. So this is actually, we kind of cheated with this one. It's on our responsibility list. Most of its population is sort of south of here, but it's such a striking bird. And so this is one we picked because it's really good looking. But also it tells us a lot. There's a lot of guidance out there on how to manage for these birds because they do like interior forests. So if you hear that robin and you're deep in the woods, you're probably hearing a scarlet tanager. And despite being really red, they're hard to see because they do like to nest up really high. So this is sort of of that 90% that Steve's talking about. This guy's kind of the outlier. He tends to be nesting high in these kind of really thin, sticky, twiggy nests that you can almost see right through. So that's our mature. I think this is the last of our mature forest birds. Oh, no, I'm sorry, I forgot about Steve's favorite, right?
Yeah, well, becoming a favorite,
Becoming a favorite?
along with the other 11.
Oh, that's right. So Steve mentioned this one, you know, anybody? 30% of the population living here?
Black-throated blue warbler.
Yeah, black-throated blue warbler. Also has this little white wing patch. I had a friend who, a birder that was saying, he thought it was like, this kind of like those, what do they call that? They stick that handkerchief in their pocket for dandy, you know, little white handkerchief. You asked earlier about the female.
Yes. Not so striking.
Not so striking, but she still has this mark. But she's got this little broken eye ring up here. I don't know if this is true or not, but for a long time you hear stories that they thought these were two different species.
Right.
Because the male will be singing up a little bit higher in the forest, and she's down in like hobblebush and low shrubs, nesting, keeping quiet, and he's out there kind of foraging and kind of keeping track. And what he says is, breathe, 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 breathe.
It goes up.
Yeah, it kind of goes up. So Holly, you sort of think about it, blue up to the sky. So it's blue. And then we had one of our forester workshops, somebody said they were saying, veneer, veneer, veneer. Okay, that works for you?
Also says beer, beer, beer.
Yeah, beer, beer, beer. Yeah, so anything kind of coming up with these mnemonics. So, and then they do this little chippy thing here. So that's our black-throated blue warbler. So that's that kind of mix of hardwood. So now we're going to kind of get into that more mixed woods, more towards softwood kind of conditions. So Steve's got these trees in here. So a couple of those that are coming up here. This first one, which, right? See that? What's this cue here?
It's black-throated.
It's a black-throated, but in this case, the black-throated green, because it does have a little bit of, it's sort of an olive green, but if you can see this, that's a great indicator. It has a couple wing bars here, this yellow cheeks, the black throat, but they have a variety of songs that you will hear in those softwood or mixed wood conditions. Z, 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 Z.
That's what
Up and down like the Green Mountains. Z, 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 Z. So that's that black-throated green. They also have another sort of territory song that they sing. Trees, trees, murmuring trees. Okay? And that's more of a territory song. So sing that when there's another male nearby. So that the Z, 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 Z is that like, hey, females, I'm here, open for business. And the other one is like another male coming in and saying, stay out, okay? So that's our black-throated green. Tend to see them in You'll see them in hemlock stands, you'll see them in sort of mixed wood, but we have a lot of them here, so you might even find them in a hardwood stand, so. That's been your experience, hasn't it, Steve?
It has.
Yeah.
Generally, the softwoods will have a greater abundance of them than a hardwood, pure hardwood stand would. So,
And older forests, there's some studies out of Pennsylvania, the older growth stories have a higher abundance of black-throated green, so they do like older, bigger trees in their forest composition. And you'll find them like, you'll see like, even if you have like a pine tree or a couple, softwood trees, hemlocks in a hardwood, they'll key in on that. So another one, this is, we sort of have them in here, but he's kind of, I find them all
there.
I'm not sure why.
Sure how he got
But let's go with it anyway.
You must
because
have
he's
flew into a different
Yes,
atmosphere.
he's right. Because you will find this guy all over the place. So, what are we looking at here? It's a sparrow, yeah. This is a good, so that big chunky beak there, that's a good sparrow beak for breaking up seeds.
And white-throated.
White-throated, has these little lures here, the yellow. Sometimes these, this can be, instead of black, it can be brown, white, brown. And this guy's black, white, black. And they have, this is like one of my favorite songs. Oh, Sam, if you go up north of the border, they sing, "Oh, Canada, Canada." I just think that's like the song in the northern forest.
Right.
Yeah. And so, who's talking about brush piles? You'll find them in there. And you'll find them high up in the forest. We'll find them in sort of, sprucey forest types, even in hardwoods. But almost edgy kind of wood conditions. So he's kind of a generalist, but we are seeing declines in that. So, but he's a good one to think about in terms of when you're thinking about that fine woody material, that woody debris that you want to have, woody material in the forest. That's what you want to be thinking about.
Do some of them just migrate through? Going
Yeah.
That's what
So
happens.
there's
Migrate
such
through there
a,
and then
you get this
they're gone.
big wave of them, right? Like one morning I went out my yard and there was like 30 of them in the yard. And they so they travel in packs and then they start to disperse. And because they are moving through, some of them are breeding here, but they also go up into Canada, right? But now they're settling down. I think, I'm hearing less of them or seeing less of them and hearing more of them. Okay. And then, so the other one, this is the bird that's sort of hemlock. When I see hemlocks, I think of this bird. So, what are the striking features on this one? Yeah, this eye ring. Look at that. Sort of a little bit of a break here. A couple wing bars. Green, and what color is this? How would you describe that color? Yeah, blue. It's kind of a blue. So this is the blue-headed vireo. Used to be called the solitary vireo. They split the population, and now the western ones are solitary vireos. And this is a blue-headed vireo. Has sort of a lazy song to him. Here I am. In here. Up in the tree. Kind of thinking before he speaks. Good quality to have. Good back and forth. Unlike his cousin, who I don't have a picture of, but I'm going to talk about, the red-eyed vireo. And I'm going to talk about it because we are going to hear them. I am almost positive we will hear red-eyed vireos out there. That's the hardwood version of this guy. Has a red eye and a slash across it. And think about it. Red-eyed, hopped up on coffee, and just goes on. Here I am, I'm up in the tree, find me, here I am. And he sort of goes on and on and on, and no matter when, of time of day, all these other guys, they tend to get quiet around noon when it's hot, they're still singing. He's still singing. That red-eyed vireo is going on. This guy, not so much. So he's kind of the more laid-back version of contemplative version, in my opinion. I'm anthropomorphizing, right? So, but hey, I have the floor, so I'm going to. So I just love this bird. He's a solitary vireo, or the blue-headed vireo. So sometimes when you see old field guide, you'll see it mentioned that way. But he does like hemlocks, older trees. They have this habit of like building practice nests, so they'll build like this nest to show the female, look what I can do.
Spec house.
Yeah, exactly. And then they go and do the real thing. So it's just kind of a fun bird. Not one of our real long distance migrants. They do migrate down into Central America, but you will find them in the southeast United States during the winter.
Yeah, if, well, we've got the hemlock, Toledo,
Yep.
and Putney, and I'm
Yeah,
just wondering,
yeah.
are there any backup trees for this?
Yeah, I mean
Yeah,
spruce,
any
yeah,
softwood
softwoods,
again.
pines and everything, but you tend, because the hemlock is such an important feature in our landscape, you
Yeah.
do have that in it. And boy, that is, you know, the hemlock woolly adelgid, we worry about that a lot, you know. So, and what might that impact have on this bird. So.
This is one of the first of the
Yeah,
longer distance
yeah.
migrants to return in the spring. So up north where we come from, around just south of Burlington area, Montpelier, Stowe, about the 27th of April is when it starts singing. So down here, maybe the third week of April, you'll start hearing that contemplative song.
Which is great, because then if you're trying to learn these birds, all the other ones haven't come back yet to confuse you, so he's out there like kind of showing you the ropes. So it's a good one to start with, because he's here back early and kind of has that slow song. And what do I got left here? Oh, so then there's that other kind of, those pocket conditions within the forest, the swampy, wet areas, you know, that are out there, you know. This one
I
has.
think the two birds got mixed around.
Oh, is that what
you're
you're
gonna
doing?
You're gonna find that
Yeah.
orange throaty bird probably
Yeah.
showing up here. Not sure how that happened.
The orange throaty bird?
Blackbird is supposed to be in the hard softwood.
There's no black bird.
Let's see what happens.
Okay, well, boy, this is like.
Well, I'm
gonna talk, so within some of these wetter areas in our forest, we will find this bird, which is has this kind of necklace of black and yellow, striking blue, and I can't even describe this song. The colleague of mine who used to work at Audubon, Bridget Butler, used to say, it said, chip, chippity, boopity, boopity. But it's really that you kind of listen to that chip. But you'll find them in kind of, I don't know, see, you have more.
So habitat, making associations between habitat and what birds you're likely to hear in those habitats is really a key in helping them associate. So this bird, this Canada warbler, a forested wetland.
Yeah.
So you're walking through the forest, you come to these areas where it may be some standing water, maybe it's just really saturated. You've got these hummocks with sphagnum moss on them and lots of shrubs, trees have fallen down, there's logs in the ground. The overall, the tree height is much lower than it is the surrounding forest. And if it's, you know, a half acre or larger of that condition, that's the kind of place to go looking for this bird. It does show up in other, like alder wetlands and things like that, but it's more of the forested wetland embedded in the forest that I tend to think of as the prime location.
So, one of the reasons we pulled this bird out of that list is it is declining. It's another one of these, you know, 6, 7, 8% a year declines. And I don't think, we just don't have a good handle on it. There was just a conference about a month or two ago up in Canada where there's a group, international group, trying to get a handle on, you know, what's going on with this bird. So most of their population is north of the border, so we're working with partners up in Canada, but then, you know, who are our partners down in Central America and South America. These guys are really into South America in the winter and trying to figure out what's driving that decline and what can we do to reverse that. All right, so that's our birders dozen. So you're all primed and ready to go now, right? So you know, right? So any specific questions, kind of? So just, you know, again, we're looking at different habitat types. Just a couple key things to think about when you're out birding is you're looking for identifying features like those eye rings, like the color. Wing bars are often good indicators, you know, 1, 2. stripiness, that kind of stuff. So I think I'm looking to Bill here for guidance. We're gonna gather to go outside and walk and like try to pick up what we have. I think Steve and I were talking about this on the way down. We'll listen, we'll try to find birds. I think, and we'll also kind of associate that with the habitat before we get into the management things. I brought up, if you don't have binoculars, I have ones that I will lend to you for today to help us do that, and we can talk a little bit about how to use binoculars if you're not real familiar with using those.
Maybe we take like just like 5-minute break to get
Yeah,
ready
we'll
for
take
that and use restroom, and then we'll just meet
Outside.
outside there. And grab binoculars out of the box if you'd like to.
Yeah.
Good one, but right now it's kind of not working, which happens then, yeah. But it's great because then you hear, if you hear a song and you think you might know what it is, you can always reference it back. So let's go back to see if we can get this red start. Jim's trying to draw it in a little bit with his fishing. Black and reddish orange. I don't know if the lighting's good enough on there to be able to see it, but so this is kind of the habitat I would expect to find. So this bird does like saplings and young, small pole-sized trees, which we have right here. Kind of a great habitat for them. It just went off. I don't know. The lighting is pretty bad. Yeah, okay. Mostly black when it flashes itself. You see some red, reddish orange. I was in here. Can rarely see any of these birds.
Normally see them in like Carolina area?
Yes. Yep, that's another place. Yeah, exactly. What we're looking at here, but this is that young forest, that kind of early successional habitat structure, young forest, and that it's obviously open overhead. We'd say it's an open canopy, but we do have younger trees and shrubs that are growing in here. Now the nice thing about, and this happens on, obviously this is a maintained power line corridor, but if you did a harvest, a timber harvest, and you open up an area that was maybe an acre, 1 to 2 acres or minimum, and you've got regeneration of trees, would create the same kind of structure to it. So it's a young forest coming back in. And the bird community tends to be very different in these areas. Now what's interesting about power lines is that their linear nature does influence what birds are likely to be in here, because we've got, Jim had in his presentation, the chestnut-sided warbler, the pleased to meet ya bird that had that yellow top on it and the chestnut sides. So they're likely to be in here using this for breeding purposes, nesting in here. The other thing we didn't talk about is that after the breeding season is over and all these young birds are around, and they're actually at that point in July, they're already starting to think about migration in the fall. So they're going to be looking to fuel up, build up lots of fat on their body. And they do that by eating insects and fruits now. So in these open areas that have young growth in it, this is where we also find a lot of the fruit-producing trees and shrubs. So birds tend to move, they may have nested over there in the mature woods, and they move into these openings that have good fruit resource and also dense cover, because little baby birds aren't too wise to the world yet. They're more likely to be preyed upon if they're out in the open. So they like this dense cover that's in here. But power lines generally don't provide that same function as a more circular opening would. Because they like to get into the middle of these places, and there's really not a lot of middle in here from a bird's perspective. So it's nesting habitat, and there's an alder flycatcher out here, right there. It's saying, "Ribby!" It's kind of the,
So, question, these birds move across, but are they territorial only some of the time?
the territorial aspects are really related to the nesting season. So when they return in the spring, they start that. Males will define a territory, at which point to find a mate and try to reproduce and raise the next generation of their species. When that's all done, that territoriality really goes away.
Let's say and it's not like a robin, they describe it as a robin that's taking singing lessons. It's kind of embellish things a little bit more, like the contestants on American Idol, they always throw a couple extra notes in there. That's what the rose-breasted grosbeak does. And they're a forest bird, so so you'll find them deep in the woods, but they kind of like tall, big tall trees. So you'll often see them under those. But that's that song. It's kind of just a little bit more.
Here. If you look further up that way and up the hill, it's been recently cut back to the point where that's not what the alder flagcup is not looking for, that totally open stage of vegetation.
Well, that just happened.
Yeah, this is what they're looking for. So,
Did someone talk to the utility company to get them to leave and not just tear it down?
Is this the Velcro line?
How this happens?
Yes.
It's very bare up that way.
Yeah, I mean, the utility companies are getting a little bit better about not just making it straight through. So they do try to leave some shrub in there. We've been working with them a lot in the Champlain Valley Velcro.
Yes,
There's
go
a
ahead.
purple finch right behind you, mulberries, that's right in sort of a 12 o'clock in the truck.
Oh, yeah, I see it.
straight ahead.
Behind this first row of all these behind that, there's like a little shrub with
Looks like he's dipped in raspberry juice. Is that?
Yep.
come over here.
Your landscape in your property, unless you own a lot of land. We look at a landscape as about 2,500 acre area. So we kind of draw that. This would be using, we would do this using mapping software on the computer, kind of make an area that's about 2,500 acres, and then use aerial photography to estimate the best we can how much of that 2,500 acres is in different habitat conditions. Mm-hmm. And from that 2,500 acres, we have a starting point of shooting for 3 to 5% of that 2,500 acres in a young forest, 0 to 15-year forest at any given time. That's considerably less, even from NRCS, I believe. This 10% number will come out a lot, and we could go up to 10%. We're not saying that's not an appropriate number, but I think it's important to think about that whole landscape that you're in. And 3 to 5% of 2,500 acres is, well, 5% is 125 acres, right?
Yes.
Yeah, I did that math properly. So 125 acres of young forest in patches that are at least an acre, each one. Ideally 2 acres is probably a better way if you're really shooting for the birds that are going to be found in this area. So that's kind of what we're suggesting as a starting point to be thinking about. Some properties have a great opportunity for doing that. If you have, maybe an old white pine stand that's really, the quality of the wood is not very good. It's just not a very nice stand from a timber perspective. Might be good to regenerate that with an opening that's 2 acres, or even maybe a little bit bigger in some settings. Whereas you had a nice veneer sugar maple stand, that's probably not the place to go in and do that sort of thing. So that's what we would recommend as a starting point to try to accommodate the young forest birds that nest in that, but also the mature forest birds that are going to be in that landscape around it. So does the 20-acre clear cut have applicability? It very well may in some landscapes that are extremely thousands and thousands of acres of mature closed canopy forest. But then you also have to think about, well, is that an area where there are a lot of invasives, non-native plants that are likely to colonize that once we open it all up? You have to factor some of those things into the equation as well. Landowner objectives. Are you the landowner who wants to have a 20-acre opening on your property? Or are you more comfortable with a 1 to 2 acre opening or a couple 1 to 2 acre openings scattered around your property? So those all should be factored in to deciding what you would do on your own individual property.
Anybody wants to see the alder flycatcher? Straight ahead, there's a set of alders on the right side before the gap that by the pole there, this first row. The very top of that one on the right, at 12 o'clock, the very top, there's an alder flycatcher that's just flew down to about 2 o'clock.
Yep.
On that same tree. If you look carefully, you can see it. In the shrub. So of course now he's the biggest one in the place. I like I've lost him. He's fell at about 2 o'clock. About what? About 2 o'clock. 2 o'clock? Yeah. But he's gray. I can't know what it has a couple light, very light wing bars on it. Still there. He's been. Anybody else seen him?
Yeah, I see him. I see him. Yeah, 2 o'clock.
Blowing around maybe a foot in. Right on the edge, at about 2 o'clock in that alder.
So that's gonna grow. That's gonna come back
It'll
pretty
grow
quick.
something.
Yeah, it's gonna likely grow the same. So the alder that we have
Except
here.
it's got very dry places, so.
Yeah, that's true.
Because he talked about those birds that are, even the forest birds are going to come out here during the fall because they're using that fruit is great for converting. They convert that to fat really quickly, and then once they change that fat, they burn really quickly going south. So anything that's sort of think through the year, flowers are going to draw in the bugs, and little insects and bees and everything, which they're going to feed on in the spring, and then during the fall migration, they'll make use of the berries. So kind of think
In the field here is go out to a place in the forest that has not had any recent management. It's been at least 20 years or more, right, since any harvesting has happened out there. And we're going to actually run through a little exercise about, and this is what you can do at home, of how to start to assess those different habitat variables that we got introduced to indoors, the understory, midstory, snags and cavities, coarse and fine woody material. How can you start to look at your own property to see which of those elements of habitat do you have, which ones do you not have? And then from there, you can start to think about how do we use management to achieve those things that are either lacking or just not in high abundance anyway. I will say that it's not, we're not necessarily saying that, remember each one of those understory, midstory, et cetera, we're not going to find high amounts of all of those things on every acre. It's just not possible. But you would do this, walk your property, take an assessment every now and again and kind of just average it out in your head. Overall, did I have a very good understory in my forest? If I didn't, is it something that would be desirable to try to encourage along and to get? And if so, how can I do that? So we'll do the assessment part, and then we're going to turn it to George to talk about some of the ways we can use active management and silviculture to get some of those things to happen on the ground. Again, what we're trying to do at this point, and you can imagine this is your own property that you're going to be working on to do this. We're now faced with the fact that we're interested in birds, among other objectives for our forest, and trying to provide good quality habitat for those birds to hopefully successfully raise the next generation of their species. So that's why they're here. They came back here to do just that. But not all forests are created equal. There's a lot of variety of forests. There's a lot of different quality of forest that we have out here on the landscape. So you're trying to figure out, of all these possible birds that nest in Vermont, which ones are likely to be utilizing my forest in its current condition that it's right now? And then how might I manage this forest going into the future that would keep it really good if it's good already, or maybe enhance it, make it even better so that there are more places for this diversity of birds to find nesting sites and places to go looking for food. So that's the purpose of doing this kind of inventory or assessment of current conditions. What you have on your paper there is just a simple way to, this is very qualitative. We're not collecting data in terms of numbers and doing anything like that. This is very qualitative to just start to get a sense, a feel for what's here. And the way it works, and the paper is just again for reference to remember, but we use both hands, particularly the index, middle, and ring fingers on both hands. Our left hand, I forget what the sheet says, is left hand the live stuff? Yeah, I think it is. Living plants, right. Is the left hand. And as you hold them out in front of you, it actually creates kind of a layering effect. You've got layers of vegetation, of living vegetation now by holding your fingers out in front of you. Your index finger is going to be reminding you to look at the canopy overhead. And by looking at the canopy overhead, there's a couple things that we're going to be noting. First of all, in its simplest form, are we in a hardwood forest where the majority of the trees are those that will, deciduous trees that will lose their leaves in the fall, like the maples, the beech, the birch, the oak, the ash, things like that? Or is it more softwood, hemlock, white pine in particular in this area? Or is it a mix of both of those things? Because remember Jim's part of the presentation, the way we organized those birders dozen was by kind of forest type. We had our hardwood birds, we had our softwood and mixed forest birds. So that's step number one. So let's do it. We look up at the canopy overhead. At its simplest form, we try to identify whether we have hardwood trees, do we have some softwood trees, do we have mostly softwood trees, or do we have a little bit of everything?
Mainly hardwood.
Yep, I heard a yep.
Yeah, a bit of everything.
That's an answer to get it. Say yep.
I think it's mainly hardwood, with a few softwoods.
Yeah, you're looking in different, so you kind of, when you do this, you don't just want to stand and look right up around. You're going to look around. Give a complete turn around, get a good picture of where you are. Because if I look here, I would say hardwood. And if I look here, I would say, well, both. Mix of both. So really,
which understory here?
Right now, we're just going to look at the understory is going to be our ring finger coming up in a minute. Right now, we're looking at the overstory. We've got really mostly hardwood, but there is some white pine, especially as we move further back in here, mixing in. Now, from the fact that we do have some white pine in here, this would be the quiz part if I really wanted to quiz you. Maybe I should.
Uh-oh.
I'm going to.
Birds.
Hardwood, mature hardwood forest birds. You have to remember that Jim talking and dancing up there in front of you this morning. Does anybody remember one bird that was in that hardwood forest section? Scarlet tanager. Okay, so right off the bat, we might think we've got, and we didn't do this part yet, but this is a mature, from the way a bird perceives it, this is a mature forest. And we do have hardwoods, which is where scarlet tanagers are often going to be found. So that's one bird we might expect to find out here. What about a bird that would be in a mixed forest, or heavier even to softwood?
I don't have my notes.
Not so easy.
Where did the wood thrush live?
The wood thrush?
Yeah.
Wood thrush is probably going to be. It was in the hardwood section. So there's another hardwood. Scarlet tanager and wood thrush would be hardwood birds.
Now we're looking for mixed.
Black-throated blue warbler, another generally more of a hardwood species. Good. So now we're developing a list.
What about the veery?
Birds. What's that?
The veery?
The veery.
Yeah.
Especially because we have some of, Jim said they like the wetter areas, which we have a little bit wetter area down here.
This
Veery
right
is another
here.
good possibility.
Look at this fern. This is wet right here.
The ferns.
The royal fern is a definite wet.
Yep, indicating the conditions here, soils are moist at least. Yep, good. Well, the softwood bird, Which one?
White-throated sparrow, is that in the south?
White-throated sparrow was in that section, although it wasn't really supposed to be. That's my fault, because I was reviewing
In the
this
softwoods, it was
slideshow.
supposed to be.
Well, we can find them in softwood, but the key thing with them is actually more of the younger, brushier stuff in this more mature forest. So that's it. It flew into the wrong spot in the presentation. Well, you remember the red-eyed vireo we heard singing over and over? That was the hardwood cousin to the other vireo. That was a little more deliberate, thought
The
more.
blue-headed.
The blue-headed vireo. So we have some pine. Jim associated with hemlock, but it could associate with pine as well. So that's a possibility. So we've got a short list of potential birds that are in here. The other thing, besides looking at what whether it's hardwood or softwood, we can also look at individual species if you're able to identify some of your trees. But I'll say this, mostly, by and large, birds are going to associate more with the forest type than they are the individual species of trees that make up that forest type, if that makes sense to you. So it's not necessarily important whether it's beech or maple as it is that it's hardwood. There are exceptions. There's always going to be an exception. There are a few trees that we know birds do align more closely with, and red oak is one. See, Jim talked about the scarlet tanager, seeming to have an association with red oak. It also has an association with hemlock. So red oak is a good one. The other thing about red oak is that it tends to have, studies have shown, a higher diversity of native insects that use it compared to some other trees, maple in particular, more than maple. So that's a good thing. So that's a valuable habitat characteristic. Another species is yellow birch, which we don't necessarily, I don't think we have any right here. You have some? Okay. Yellow birch also has a good diversity of insects on it, and some studies in New Hampshire showed that when yellow birch was part of the forest composition, insect-eating songbirds, which are most of the ones we're talking about, would select that tree out over beech and maple as a place to go looking for insects. Likely because it has a higher diversity of insects. Also, the theory is that if you know yellow birch, the leaf stem is very short. So when a bird is perched on a branch and it's gleaning insects off of leaves, if the leaf stem is very short and you're on a branch, that leaf's pretty much right in front of you. So you just go underneath it and you get it. A maple has a longer leaf stem, so it's a little bit maybe more challenging. I don't know if that's true, but that's some of the theories behind it.
One thing that's interesting, and this is only about lumber, and you're leaning on a black birch. Most people cannot tell the difference between black birch and yellow birch lumber. The trees are very, very, very similar, and they also grow all alike. I mean,
So
so
black birch may fill that role too.
it may fill that role too. I don't know that, but I hadn't heard that before.
Another one out here, and I don't see any aspen right here, but remember we talked about the cavity nesters, the yellow-bellied sapsucker, so larger diameter aspen or popple, as we'd call it locally. That's a great tree. From a timber perspective, it's not one that we kind of look to propagate. We have to cut pretty aggressively to propagate it, but to keep it in the forest because it's selected as a cavity nesting tree for cavity nesters is a good thing. Paper birch, white birch, is another one that birds will often select for cavity nesters for excavating cavities. And we have some small diameter white birch that's down there with the white bark on it. They prefer bigger diameter trees than those, but it's still a component forest and another species of tree that may have a little higher habitat value than others. So being able to identify some of the trees is good, but it's more important just to know do you have hardwood or do you have softwood or do you have a mix, because then you can associate certain birds with that and you're on your way to creating a short list of birds that you can start thinking about as we go through the rest of the things, the items on here. The other thing with the canopy is just looking at whether it's a closed canopy, meaning as you look up, there are lots of big gaps and spaces between the tops of the trees, or is it pretty well closed in? Here, I would say it's pretty well closed in, so we'd call this a closed canopy forest. And if it were an open canopy forest, we'd be probably in a very different place, and we'd start thinking more about the chestnut-sided warbler And in some places, maybe that alder flycatcher that we heard in that more open canopy. But this is a closed canopy, so we're talking about a mature, from a bird perspective, what we think of as a mature forest. Not an old forest or an old growth forest, but a mature forest from the way birds tend to use things. So there's our canopy. Pretty straightforward. The middle finger, now as we come down, is going to be looking at
Mid-story.
the mid-story. Does anybody remember what height in feet
Six
the
to
mid-story?
6 to 30, yeah.
Good. 6 to 30 feet in height. When we're thinking about mid-story, and we're going to be kind of assessing whether it's here and how functional it is, we don't have to just think about trees that are 30 feet tall or less. They can be trees taller than 30 feet, but have branches and foliage in that range. So birds like the vireo, the blue-headed vireo, the wood thrush, that often nest within that height range. Blue-headed vireo in particular, their nest is somewhat unique. You'll find a fork on a branch, and it'll be a suspended cup underneath that fork. Red-eyed vireos do the same thing. And it's often in that mid-story, but it's not necessarily in that, like that beech tree right behind us, which is 12 feet tall, 10 feet tall. It could be in a much taller tree that has lower branches in there. But it can also, so it's the taller trees that have branches within the 6 to 30 foot level, but it's also trees that are themselves in that 6 to 30 foot level, like this striped maple right back here, goosefoot maple, as it's called. So that's a tree that would fit right in that mid-story category, provide some of the structure we're looking for. So as we now assess the function of this level of the forest, we're trying to think about, okay, function is a place to put a nest, lots of places to put nests that are going to be somewhat concealed, not just out in the open where a predator might find us. So we're really looking at the cover, the amount of cover that's provided by leaves and branches in that height range. And when you do these assessments like this is where you have to get very qualitative. It's one thing to look up and say we had hardwoods and softwoods. That's kind of black and white. Another thing to say, well, yeah, it's pretty good, or no, there's not much in that mid-story range. So it gets very subjective. And you can, think about this in really any way you want. Sometimes people say, well, I'm going to use a scale, a numerical scale, 0 to 5. 0 meaning there's no mid-story. 5 meaning it's just dense saplings in here. And think of it that way. Or you could say it's low, it's high, it's somewhere in between, medium.
We do percent full.
Percent full.
You see, that is, 65% full, something like that.
Yeah.
That gives you a qualitative idea of where are we from.
Yeah, so there's no right way to do it, is my point. You get an idea of how much is there of this element, this habitat element around you. Now, having never done this before, it's hard to kind of relate to some kind of standard metric. To say, well, it's more than the last place I looked, or it's less than the last place I looked. So you're just going to kind of have to wing it and look around you and say, I think there are lots of places for a bird that nests in the mid-story to place their nest, or it forages in the mid-story, there's a place for them to go do it. Or I don't think there are many places at all. That's kind of how you might look at this particular element. And again, look all around you, because it's variable here in this one particular spot.
The other side of that rock wall looks pretty dense. Yeah.
Yeah, I would agree. And on that side, down in there, a little bit more open, right? So if we averaged it out, high, 5, or 1 to 2 over here, lower, maybe we're somewhere in this one spot. It's pretty, it's here. It's not as dense as it certainly could be, but it's also a lot more than it could be. So it's probably pretty decent. There's probably enough places for things that nest and forage in that level to find what they're looking for in this area. And the final one, the ring finger, is our understory layer. 0 to 6 feet in height. Woody stem plants. Again, it could be higher than 6 feet, but have foliage and branches in that layer.
Hardly any. Yeah.
Hardly any. Kind of scattered individuals as opposed to good clumps of it. And I would agree with that. It's definitely less. There's less understory than there is midstory in here. Now, if we relate that all back to the birds, the short list of birds we made, scarlet tanager, black-throated blue warbler, wood thrush, let's pick those three. Scarlet tanager tends to be more abundant when there's oak or hemlock. Well, we don't have that right here. Doesn't mean it's not going to be a place for them. But they also nest higher up in the canopy. So, canopy is nice, established, pretty full up in there. I would say, yeah, that's a bird that probably could find some habitat here. If we had more oak, if we had oak in here and some scattered hemlock, maybe be a little bit more attractive place to them than this. But it's probably going to meet their needs. A wood thrush, which generally nests in the mid-story, 6 to 30 foot level. What do we think about, again, from this one point? Is this a decent place for a wood thrush to find a nest? Sure, I think so, especially right over there. This is looking at the stand level. We're now in a stand of trees. If I apply a landscape level assessment to this, and I look at what's over there, and I see that it's open field, I know that we're not that far in the woods from openings. And I'm like, well, one thing I know about open land in Vermont, particularly if it's agricultural land, is that there are these birds called brown-headed cowbirds.
Sure are.
If you're not familiar with them, they are what's called a nest parasite. And what they do is they are found in the open area, and they look for a host bird that builds a nest in the forest like a wood thrush. Female goes in there, finds a host nest, and lays an egg in it. One egg. No big deal. But it is a big deal. And she might do that 40 times during the course of the nesting season. And when that one egg hatches in that wood thrush nest, it's bigger and more aggressive than the host babies, the wood thrush babies, and usually outcompetes them. So that wood thrush nested here thinking structurally it had good mid-story. The wood thrush didn't think about mid-story, but it knew that that's where it likes to nest. So it nested here, it laid its eggs, but the chances that it survived, perhaps if we have cowbirds, might be diminished based on that. So that's bringing a landscape kind of scale view to thinking about it. And then the understory, which is where our black-throated blue likes to nest. Do you think we might hear a lot of black-throated blue warblers in here?
No. What about the green one?
Over there?
We might hear them here.
No, I hear something over there.
Oh, you hear something? Okay.
What is it?
Well, I'm hearing red-eyed vireo.
Yeah.
You hearing anything else?
The wind.
The wind. Probably not a lot of places for that bird to nest in here, but it's not to say it won't nest here. There might just be enough scattered around you get one. But here's what it does affect. When you have higher quality habitat, which has the right, the necessary variable for each species, each bird pair can have a smaller territory size. So they don't have to go quite as far looking for a nest site or food resources. That means you can get more more pairs in the same area. So you get a greater abundance of birds overall. If you have low quality habitat for a species, they're going to have generally larger territories in order to find all the things they're looking for, and therefore you won't have as many of that species in a given area. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So that's the living stuff. Overstory, mid-story, understory. Now let's go to our right hand. Same idea. Index finger are going to be the standing snags, standing dead trees, and or live trees with cavities, holes in them. So as you look around, do you see standing dead trees?
Yes.
There's a big pine right over there.
And I know down there there's
Not too many.
There's another one over there. It looks like it's probably a red maple or a beech. snag back there. There's one right here.
You're standing?
Yeah.
Right there.
That one that you're standing next to?
Yeah, this right here.
Oh, yes.
You don't want your whole
Is
forest
that
to
big
be
enough to
dead
be?
trees.
Yeah, I know.
So there's a good point. Many times we'll find lots of small diameter snags in a forest. And some bird chickadees are cavity nesters, so they'll nest in those smaller diameter snags. But to maximize the value of those snags, the bigger the better. Bigger meaning 10 inches, 9 to 10 inches, we call it DBH, diameter breast height. So 9 to 10 inches around it and about this high. So that and bigger are going to be used by more species of wildlife than smaller ones would be. So that certainly, that over there is greater than 10 inches in diameter. And there are some targets, management targets to aim for, like how many snags per acre would be ideal to have. One of the most common numbers you hear is at least 6 snags. 8. Let's say you stop at 6, but per acre.
But there aren't any negatives to having snags, either in terms of the birds or the crop trees.
No, there's no negative to it. It's usually a question of can I get to a minimum, as opposed to worrying about being more than I want. I mean, there are issues around snags, particularly if you're in the forest or working the forest or recreating the forest, because they come down eventually. And you know, depending on that, how much use you're going to be having in the forest, where those snags are located, you may or may not want them in certain areas. Yeah.
Everything, and there was some nice snags, and the question was not the top, so that, you could lose the trunk.
Oh, I see.
And so then the question is, what about that?
Sure. Yeah, that's a good question. And the question, if you didn't hear it, was if you had a snag, could you cut it off at a certain height and still have it function, but it wouldn't be as dangerous? Maybe coming down.
So I was wondering if like one that still has a lot of this leaf.
So there's a lot of stuff going on with these snags. There's nesting that's happening, there's feeding that's happening, there's perching even. So that pine snag there has lots of perch sites on it. It has lots of, I don't see any cavities in it right now. Maybe there are some on the other side. But there's different functions they can have. So we could cut that thing off at halfway, and it would still probably have some perch sites on it. They wouldn't be high perches, they'd be low perches. We'd like to have a mix of both high and low. But where the birds are feeding, foraging, like you get some of those things, they have those big oval holes on them. Those are feeding cavities by affiliated woodpeckers, and you'll see those anywhere on the trees. Wherever the insects are, those holes are made. But the nest cavities, which are the smaller, usually rounder holes, are usually somewhere kind of in that mid-story height range. So if we cut that off at 20 feet or 15 feet, some birds may not use it for nesting. They might still use it for foraging. So I wouldn't make that my general practice, but it might be an option in certain places that are, yeah. Yep. No, it's a.
But at least you could
You keep something. You would keep some value there instead of having the whole thing be gone. And I don't, again, we have to really look around, but I don't see any live trees. There's no aspen right here that we might see a little hole in as a cavity, live cavity tree. But that might exist in other places. So from this one point, there's actually quite a good number of snags given the small area that we're looking at here. Middle finger is the down wood. So we were looking at standing wood, which were the snags, the cavities. Now we're going to look at the logs, coarse woody material, and the fine woody material, the tops. Let's start with the coarse woody material, like larger logs on the ground. Yeah, that's pretty well distributed over here. There's some back in here.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So there's a fair abundance of that material here in this spot. What about the fine stuff, though? The tops of trees, intact, leaving kind of like piles of branches. Nothing really here.
No, nothing really big.
That's a desirable. That would be something desirable. Yeah, there's one. There's a beech looks like over there that has some leaves on it. Okay, and then the final one is leaf litter on the floor. We just heard it. 2 minutes ago, there was an oven bird singing back over this way, going teacher, 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 teacher. Or another way to think about an oven bird would be to think it says pizza, 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 because you make a pizza in the oven. Right? Remember what the key habitat variable was for them?
Leaf litter.
Leaf litter, right here on the ground. And this doesn't, I do this a lot, but I always have to preface it by saying it doesn't do justice to an oven bird doing it, because they don't have hands. But this is essentially what you'd be looking at for an oven bird nest. Pile of leaves with a small hole at the base going into it, and that would be it.
Wow.
No, it tends to be packed a little tighter than what I'm doing here. It's not held by any saliva or anything like that, or spider webs or anything. Some birds use in their nests.
How about a woodcock nest?
Woodcock nest pretty much right on the ground. They don't construct the nest. At least scratch out even some leaves sometimes.
So given that there's a field and a wet area and a woods, would this be a place where you might?
It could be, particularly if we have a spot where there's some of that rushier stuff besides the power line.
Ah, okay.
Okay, that's that dense young
Oh,
forest
they need that
habitat
too.
type is an important part of it.
Okay.
So if we have some of that somewhere, then, well, we've heard woodcock down. Where am I looking?
They were saying they.
Oh yeah, we heard woodcock down
one out
the
of here.
Oh, yes, yes.
We
and
flushed
Okay.
one in this area, and we heard lots of them in the fields
we sat out there
at
with
night.
lunches.
Okay, so they're here.
Yeah.
And this would be the spot the nest would be built in. All right. That's pretty much it. There's a little bonus thing you can do with the advanced levels it says here on the bottom, which are you're using your thumbs. Those are kind of if you have water aquatic features. Your left hand, if you have a rocky bottom stream that's moving through your forest, that's a great place for one of our responsibility birds called the Louisiana water thrush. Pretty much the only place they're going to nest are along rocky bottom, swifter moving streams in a forest setting. And then the other hand would be those forested wetlands where that Canada warbler tends to like to nest. So that's kind of adding to special unique features embedded within your forest stand that you could look at. There's usually some softwood growing in those forested wetlands, but it doesn't have to be. No, it can be a hardwood forest that has a forested wetland in it. All right, so to recap now that very rapid assessment we just did, we have a mature forest with a closed canopy. It's mixed hardwood, softwood, mostly hardwood, but some softwood. We have a pretty well established mid-story, but not a lot of understory. We have lots of snags here in this place. We have a good amount of coarse woody material on the ground, not a lot of fine woody material, but a nice leaf litter layer that's here. And most of the time you're going to have a nice leaf litter layer, but not always. Because some places, earthworms are removing it. It seems hard to imagine until you see it.
It's pretty impressive.
It's pretty impressive.
They can decompose a leaf litter in one season. So you come out in late August or something like that, in some places and you'll see bare ground. And that's usually on very enriched sites. Normally it's going to have to be a very good soil to determine that best. This has got a couple years of litter. You pick it like that once to say, well, that's last year. Oh, and then we get another year below that. And so maybe we're looking at 2 to 3 years of accumulation here. And that's kind of what you'd expect in the Northeast until you get into these very rich limestone-rich soils. and then throw some worms in. And it turns over. The trees will grow faster, I think, when you have that kind of turnover of the nutrients, but it's not, but it starts to simplify the forest structure pretty substantially.
Earthworms are not native here, or?
There are some worms that are native, but the worms that are the problem worms are European worms, which Charles Darwin was responsible for studying back when some of his early work was earthworms. He was the guy that said that there's something like a ton of earthworms per acre.
Wow.
He did some study, did some sampling, weighed things. He started going, wow, that's a lot of worms.
Yeah, that is a lot of worms. So I'm not thinking about worm management. About worm management. Now we're going to say, what would we want to achieve here? What are the conditions we're going to try to promote and propagate through our management? We've got a mature forest. We're going to actually keep it that way. We know we've got young forest habitat on the power line, or hopefully it will develop more young forest in time as it grows up there. But let's just go with the idea that the landowner objective is to maintain mature forest, so supporting mature forest birds, not trying to create that young forest. So we're not going to do a 5-acre opening here, taking the overstory off.
Can I ask a question about, I mean, given that you've got a field for that, which seems sort of redundant anyway, but how far, I mean, if you're going to create an opening and you don't want, like, your cowbird or something like that, how far into the forest do you have to go to where it's safe?
So what we call that is interior forest.
Right.
The point at which those non-forest exterior landscape effects seem to diminish as you go further into the woods. And interior forest conditions start at, what do they say, 200 meters. So it's like 600 feet. Go into the woods 600 feet and you start to minimize some of that stuff becoming an issue. So we're not 600 feet into the woods at this point.
The other thing is corridors. If you have several roads coming into a place like this, then it's an entryway for birds.
Right.
Yeah,
For
they will
birds you
follow
don't
those,
want.
particularly linear wide
So they always
roads
say
into
if
the
you make a
woods.
road that goes in, curve it, or trail.
Oh, okay.
So the bird doesn't just look and go, there we go.
Oh. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
But the field is actually, so the field over there though, creating young forest habitat here would not be redundant because that's grasses and things, it's not the shrubby stuff. So we could create young forest habitat here if we wanted to, and actually in terms of placement on the landscape, this might be a better place to do it than back in that interior forest. Keep it out closer to the edge. Or join it to the power line. Find a spot if you wanted to create more of that young forest. You've already got some of it in the power line. Find a spot along there where the forest is right for doing that, and do it there. But we're just going to go with the idea we're going to try to maintain mature forest and those birds that use this kind of forest, not the chestnut-sided warblers and associated species. So, George.
Yes.
We know what we want to. We know we want to keep this mature forest. We don't want to put big openings in here, but we would. We've got a nice. We do have some species diversity in terms of the trees, and species diversity is always going to be good for wildlife too, and having that. But we know we'd like some young understory to be in here, and we also want some fine woody material that we don't really have. Can we do it?
Things you could do, and a lot of it comes down to landowner goals and objectives. I'm glad Steve pointed that out because the process that I'm going to say briefly is called goal clarification. So you may have a plan. Oh, I want to sustain species diversity. I love wildlife. Well, that's it. And then somebody like me, Steve, or Jim might go, well, why don't you do a 2-acre opening? And you might say, well, what's that going to look like? Well, take it to see one. And you might say, I hate that. So then you got to go back to the goal and say, okay, maybe I don't want to do the 2-acre opening here. Maybe I've got another plan for this. And we are thinking about, well, and there's no point in coming into a stand like this, which is these black birches are growing like mad. They are very tall. Indicator of the suitability to a tree to a place is height growth, and they have grown like mad. Those are probably 30 years old, and they are up there almost 60 feet, if not 60 feet. They're going fast, so they're overcrowded. You have a red maple in there that may be a little bit older, but it may be actually the same age, but it have a little more light and it put on more diameter. The trees here, I'm going to guess, those understory trees that we're calling mid-story, they're the same age. They were shaded. So most of these situations are kind of even age. The canopy gets to a point where everything kind of starts at once. And even age means within a 7 or 8 or 9 year age, they're all about the same. All these full-size trees and some of these what we call false apples. So then you start to say, well, these pines aren't going to make it forever. It just isn't going to happen. They're going to start to be snagged. They're going to start to fall down. So that gets to be a landowner choice, saying, I really like looking at these, or not. I don't mind going on to something else. We actually have two situations here. This situation, you might say, okay, let's thin these birch. They're too crowded. There's no question. They're too crowded. For any of them to grow, they are locked in. There's a thing we call basal area, which is the stocking parameter. Black birch seems to get the highest stocking level of almost anything. It really grows densely. And they sometimes won't get any bigger than something like that. They're very slow to put on diameter. In a crowded situation, they don't express dominance. They don't differentiate in height very fast. So you probably want to thin them. And you might take out something like that red maple, which is it's suppressing the growth of those. Now, as you start doing this thinning in this area here, you will allow more light to come to the forest understory. The reason there's nothing here is because you've got several layers of shade here. So you've got this high level of shade, and you got this lower level of shade. If you were to take out all that lower level, all those beech and saplings that are down and coming into mid-story, you'd start getting something to come in here because the light is going to get there. But you've got two layers of shade here. So once you start thinning this, you're going to, in that top layer, you will start to encourage things in the forest understory without question. So you'll end up developing this condition, slowly developing that condition where you will have a layer here and some mature trees. That's probably the best goal for this place in terms of wildlife, is to get to that point right here, where you've got 2 layers in the forest instead of kind of 1.5 or whatever this is here.
George, opening it up, are you going to be encouraging the ferns?
Oh, I think you get other things to come in here than ferns. I mean, there are a few saplings around. I think you'd find black birch would come in. You'd find sugar maple. I mean, this is a nice soil. You'd probably find
And these
the little maple coming in. They'll start to show up.
These are sort of nice ferns.
It'll start to come in. So if you get enough light, the trees disperse seeds regularly. So trees will find their way. Tree species will find their way in. This situation is really quite different because in there you have all these pines remaining, and you have a mid-story that is not, well, if you were to cut all those pines, you'd have much more widely spaced younger class, because they aren't as dense. They're behind us here. And so that's a little strange, because you will invariably then get a lot of regeneration in a place like that. So if you were saying, I wouldn't mind a group someplace, or I wouldn't mind, I wouldn't say this for sure, but you might say that's not a bad place to do that, because we're not going to sacrifice a lot in the forest in that mid-story level right there. There's not much of it. If you start falling those pines, you're going to break half of that mid-story anyway. So it's kind of it's not clear to me that you'd want to try to manage for that mid-story right there. I'm not sure you could really do it successfully. It would not be dense. It would be very widely spaced when you're done. So you're going to get additional regeneration in there without question. And we have a concept in forest management, which is maturity. And I don't like to use economic maturity or biological maturity. I use the concept of pathological maturity. And you've got trees around that are becoming pathological. And they are, you got the top that broke out of a pine over there's some pines that fell down over here. So you sort of get to an age where the things that are making this forest change on its own. And these older trees around us. So you decide, well, do I want to accelerate this? Where are we going to go? And I'm not exactly sure you could maintain, until you get up a little farther, you could probably maintain the mid-story farther away. But right here, you might not be able to. And so you'd end up with something that wasn't perfect. You'd end up with some young things extended up like that, and then the mid-story maybe that would remain. So it's not ever an ideal situation. You kind of try for what you call the optimum. What's the optimum?
And we've actually mentioned that already, that we're not going to see each one of these things at high levels on every acre, right? So it's just getting enough of it scattered around, even if it's patchy, that all of those elements are here in the functional level.
You don't have enough. I mean, I think with the point where we're kind of getting, but my guess is you don't really have enough of this 1 to 6 foot level. That's kind of what's not here. And I think when we get over that way, maybe we'll be able to think more about that. Because you have a younger forest area here, which is excluding that because of the shade. This canopy hasn't really moved high enough to let light in.
So if you were to thin some of these black birches, which ones and how many would you take out to kind of accomplish that in your view?
Well, that's another type of question. That's really into forest management. What I would do is I'd figure that at those diameters, you'd probably want them about 16 feet apart. Well, actually, what I would say is, to go further, say, well, let's go with this whole crop tree approach, figuring 50 years from now, 75 years from now, when we're all getting on in years, and we need the money. What we would do is we would say 28 feet apart, 30 feet apart, we're going to release trees that we hope to grow for a long time. That's going to be about 60 trees per acre, something like that. So, you know, 30 times 30 is whatever, into 43, 5, 60. That's 55 trees per acre, something like that. 43, 5, 60 is the number of square feet in an acre. So that's kind of what you do. And then in between, you can maybe do a little thinning, but those trees that you want to release finally, you want to have grow for the longest period of time, those are the ones you focus on. And they would be the best, cleanest, smoothest stems, highest quality. And if you can do it, you'd maintain diversity. You'd stay away from species like white birch because it probably can't live to be 75 years old. So you work with black birch, which can grow, last a long time. If you're lucky to find some oaks in there, and I did see a couple. Then you have to make a decision about, well, yeah, the oak's here, but is it going to be able to grow in competition with all these black birch? Probably not. The site's too rich. So it's a complicated, kind of complicated.
So all of this thinning we're talking about, or mention of a small group up here, which we haven't really talked about, define what that means. Neither of those approaches to managing this is going to switch the bird community over to this young forest group. It's still going to be the same suite of birds, the scarlet tanager, the wood thrush, the black-throated blue warbler, and we're actually trying to make it better for those birds. And if you were to come out here, a couple years after the harvest that was done very lightly, you'd almost have a hard time telling that anything happened here at the scale we're talking about right now with this. The challenge with that, though, is that this isn't going to make you money. You're not going to make money off of coming out and thinning, doing a crop tree release on this stuff that's here right now. You might actually have to pay money out. Thankfully,
That's where Chuck comes.
Chuck's here. And Chuck is with the Natural Resources Conservation Service, NRCS, which has some programs that can provide some incentive payments to help get work done. It won't fund the whole project, but at least can help get some of that work done. That's going to do two things. It's going to improve the future timber resource, and it's also going to enhance the habitat for birds. We've actually worked with NRCS, Audubon and NRCS, to create some practices, as they're called, to do just that. And maybe before we wrap up, as we talk about next steps, Chuck can say a few words about what how to get in touch and maybe follow through with that if that's something of interest in you. But it only applies in those situations where it's going to be called pre-commercial or non-commercial. You're not going to be making money by doing a timber sale. If you can do that, then you don't need Chuck to come and take a look at it. It's only when it's going to cost you money, and then therefore may not get done unless you can get some assistance.
Well,
Did I say anything inaccurate?
No.
Okay.
Up here you would make money. You just have to be careful, that's all. And nowadays with felling machines, and you know, they grab the tree, cut it off, move it, put it down, you can pretty much minimize damage. With the chainsaw, you start letting that stuff fly one way or the other. It could be a little crazy.
So let's go look at another site. We'll let, you know where you want to go, and we can
She
just
sort of
take a
knows.
look at it.
You go ahead.
All right, I'm not sure how to get to this. You wanna go? This stone wall will probably take us to a different vegetation. Before we,
Yes,
when we entered here, out in the sunlight, there's just hundreds and hundreds of the same plants on both sides of the path. What is that?
Oh,
It's like a monoculture of some sort.
in the forest or in the field?
In the field,
Okay.
in the open.
Was it the bracken fern? They're about this tall?
Yes,
Yeah,
Bracken fern.
bracken fern,
bracken fern.
yes.
All right. Is it one generation? Are they 2 generations, or is that's it?
I think that's it.
Yeah, but it wouldn't be this, maybe like in all the spots.
That's right. This wouldn't be the human area. Once that's your cover,
Some
in those
deep
areas,
brush.
moisture soil.
You know, berry bushes or something like that, for the birds, that is.
Going further than this anyway. All right, so we're going to put you back to work on your own. You have your sheet. Work with your neighbor, whoever. Work on your own if you want. And let's take a look at this part of the forest and see what we think about these different habitat elements and how well represented they are or not, and what would be desirable to try to achieve here. Still, we're going to keep the mature foresting. We're not putting a big hole here, a big opening. We're going to keep the mature forest birds, but think about being able to describe what would be desirable to enhance based on the assessment that you do right now. Think you can handle that? Okay, we'll give you a couple minutes to look at that. And use your sheet if you need to remember what the different elements are. And if you're unsure of something and have a question, just come and ask.
Still not a lot of understory, is there?
I mean, there's actually over there.
A little bit, but not much.
Averaging what I see over here and over here for closed canopy, I'd say it's 5 being fully closed. I'd give it a 4, or 3.5. There's some open spots, not quite as closed as we were before.
Okay.
And the
Well, how about, so we talking about a hardwood forest?
oh, it's a
softwood
hardwood forest, definitely. I don't even see a pine.
Back in the distance.
Yeah, it's a nice hardwood forest.
Okay. So we've got a mature, closed canopy hardwood forest, and now we think about some of the same birds we talked about in the last spot as being opportunistic opportunities for those birds here. How about some of the other structure, the understory and midstory?
The mid-story is actually better than what we had before, so I guess I'd give it a 4 to 5.
It's definitely more consistent, I think, throughout. Maybe one hole over there that's not as filled in, but there seems to be more cover overall around us here than there was in that last spot. So, yeah, pretty well established mid-story.
And the understory is, again, pretty sparse. A 1, possibly a 2. I don't see much living understory here.
Okay. I think that's
better than it was down the hill.
I think that's good, right on, how I would describe it. So the understory seems to be the wild card, the missing piece here once again. The other components are definitely supporting those associated species. Good mid-story for nesting and foraging around for insects in this mature hardwood stand. How about the deadwood part? See, it wasn't so bad, was it? Is there any standing wood, any snags?
No snags.
No snags, hardly. Yeah,
There are a couple along the edges. There's some. You might get up to 6 or 8 per acre if you could see it all.
There's a snag right here. You can see the top of it. It doubles up, the 3 doubles up in there.
Yeah.
So you can kind of imagine that as far as you're probably looking out here right now, you're looking at maybe a 1/4 acre is about as far as the area that you're getting. So if you have if you're seeing 3 snags within that quarter acre, well, that you took that out, that's 12 per acre if it was the same everywhere, right? So they add up quickly. When you start seeing a few close to you, and if it's the same thing over and over again, and each time you stop, probably quite a few of them out there. So there are some. I wouldn't say there are as many here as we saw close to us down below, but there are definitely some in here. How about our coarse woody material, the big logs on the ground?
Not right in the spot, but you can see them off on the edges.
Couple up there. Would it be desirable, do you think, to put more on the ground? If you were doing this, would you think you'd want more on the ground? Or are you happy with what's here?
This day has felt not like a bunch of things being bombarding you and hard to capture any of it and glean it and know what to do with it. But hopefully it instead of that, maybe it was a little bit of that, but also gave you some ideas for what the possibilities are and what the opportunities are. And hopefully, if nothing else happened, you perhaps gained a better understanding of the important role that your forests that you own and manage have in global bird conservation efforts. It's one of the things that I found early on in doing this work that I didn't even realize, that just how important our forests are to so many different bird species. And it's such a great, we're at the core breeding range for a lot of these birds. So that's just one facet of things, a kind of an eye-opening experience to know how important your forests are to birds. But now the question is, what do we do next? And we don't want folks to leave these workshops being like, well, that was pretty cool, I learned some neat things, but now I don't know what to do back on my own property. So we're providing you with a few tools to help with that process, to guide you as to what to do next. And one of them is the guide, the Managing Your Woods with Birds in Mind guide. Has essentially all of the things that we've talked about today in one form or another put into that, hopefully in a layman's terms that are easily understandable to reference back to time and time again. But beyond that, we also want to give you other opportunities and options to meet with other professionals who can help you with your thinking as it applies to your particular piece of land and what to do next. So among them, again, Chuck with the Natural Resources Conservation Service, in particular, some of the wildlife-based and forestry-based programs that are available to help, because habitat management can cost money to do it. And as a consequence, for those folks who aren't able to put money into it, it often goes in the absence of getting done. So Chuck, do you want to just say a few words about what you have to offer, what NRCS can offer, and maybe how to get in touch with you?
Sure. Yeah, so like Steve said, I'm Chuck Armstrong with the Natural Resource Conservation Service, part of USDA. My office is in Brattleboro.
Chuck, can you just step forward?
Sure.
We're trying to get some of this on film, so we'd love to have your pretty face on camera.
Yeah, right. And so my office is in Brattleboro at the Marlboro Graduate Center. And so any of these kinds of practices or implementation of the bird habitat improvement, you can apply to our agency for financial assistance. And so you can just get in contact with me. I've got some cards, or but in a little bit more detail is that people need to have a forest management plan. And if you don't have a forest management plan, you can also apply for financial assistance to NRCS to help with that. And we have funding that people can sign up for at any time, but periodically we have cutoff dates and people, it's a competitive funding thing, and people will get a chance to get funded at different times during the year. So in some of the practices, like the early successional, I can say that, George, and, either the wildlife opening, or even with the open fields, so there's like grassland birds, keeping those open, that's another practice. Invasive plants, doing control of that is something you can apply for. Mass tree release, releasing oaks and other mass producing trees. Timber stand improvement, which is some of what was discussed today, that's something you can apply for. And it's not meant to cover the whole cost of the practice, but typically you may cover maybe 75%. It could be the different things, it's different amounts, but it could be a couple $100 per acre depending on what the practice is. So I give a good introduction. Do they have any questions?
What are the size of the grants that you can give out?
It's based on, so what we would do, is we would come out, anybody who applies, it's just a couple page application, and that just kind of gets your foot in the door, and then myself or somebody else will come out and talk to you about what you want to do. We'd actually come up with a plan, specifically what you want to do, how many acres of the different practices, and then it's so many dollars per acre, and it could be done over several years if you need to. So like if you have 3 different practices, you could do 1 per year, it'd be like a 3-year contract. And so it's just based on the need, and so there's typically it could be from a couple $1,000s up to 5 or 10, depending on what needs to be done on a particular property. Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
So in addition to that, there's also forestry-related folks. George is a consulting forester. There's a host of consulting foresters around that can help individual landowners develop management plans and think specifically about your property. But you also have a county forester who can come out to Vermont Department of Forest Parks and Recreation position to come out and do a walk with you if you're kind of really starting at the beginning of things and get an idea of where to go, again, coming from a forest management sort of angle. And that's a free service that they would provide to come out and do. They won't write your management plan for you, but that's something that the consulting forester would be available to do on a fee basis to create that plan for you. And then for more bird-specific information, we do offer a variety of different services, consultation services and assessment services to landowners. The majority of those are free of charge. And I will say, I'll be completely honest with you, that given limited staff resources, we can set up some visits to southern Vermont here, a couple over the course of the season, but I wouldn't be able to come and visit everybody during this 1 year, for sure. But I do have a handout on what those services are. They range from coming out and doing an assessment to working with your forester, if you're consulting forester, to make sure that birds are incorporated, how to get that language into your management plan if you want to make sure that birds are addressed in there. So there's a variety of things that we can do as Audubon to help to bring the bird piece to the management of your land. And then the very final piece is this personal action plan that we're going to leave you with to take home with you. You don't have to hand it in to anybody except yourself. And it just basically gives some possibilities of next steps, things that you might be able to do, depending on where you're at. Everybody's starting at a different place right now. So one of the first things, call the county forester to arrange a visit. That might be the most important next step for you. Or talk with my neighbors about what I learned today and talk about how you can collaborate with them. We were talking about this, getting neighbors together who own contiguous land and try to get, help them become aware of the role that their forest plays. And you can think about managing those parcels because, again, birds don't see corner pins. So how do you think about that as a bigger area and manage it in a way that all those different conditions, habitat conditions, can be met? So you don't have to take it, but you're welcome to take that when you go. Does anybody have any final thoughts or questions?
I did have a question about water. Would a bird nest even if the habitat was suitable if there was no water nearby? And how do they find their way back to the nest? How far do they forage away from the nest?
Well, birds find their way back to their nesting area from remarkable distances. As a matter of fact, from wherever they winter, whether it be South America, Central America, Mexico, or the southeast U.S., birds come back generally to that same general area year after year. And we know that through bird banding, which is an activity that you set up these nets that look like volleyball nets, but they're very fine, and birds fly into them. Put a little aluminum band on them with a unique identification number, and then when you catch that same bird in the same net next year, and the year after that, and the year after that, we know they come back to the same place. So they do need water. They don't need to have necessarily, I don't think, a lake or a pond to find that water. There's other places small little puddles and things like that they can get the water that they need. And even some of the foods that they're eating have water in them that they're getting from. So they can get that relatively easily compared to some of the other habitat requirements that they have. So they may travel the territory for any of these songbirds, that they generally go around and the males defend that territory against other males. Can be as small as an acre up to maybe 5 acres for most of these songbirds. And then they have something called a home range, which is generally bigger than that they'll go throughout to look for all the food and water resources that they need, but they don't necessarily defend that against other males. And that can be a slightly larger area in the territory. But we're not talking about we're not talking about moose and bear habitat that's thousands of square acres, thousands of acres of land that they're using. These are relatively smaller areas that an individual pair or individual bird would be using compared to larger mammals. So consequently, you can get a good abundance of the same species in a woodlot if you have nice quality habitat with all of those elements being provided. Good question. Any others?
I want to thank you two and George for